We're at the beginning of the end for set 11. There's only a couple patches left until set 12. 14-12 patch shook up the meta a lot for set 11, and things are looking pretty balanced. There's a lot of viable strategies from head to toe, and I think the meta is in a really good spot. So let's go ahead and break down the TFT Academy tier list for 14-12 and see what's exactly on top and what are some of the new comps in the meta. Starting at the very top of S tier, we have a new hero augment, Shen Ethereal Blades. They bug fixed Behemoth, so now it actually gives the buffs to units that are outside of 1 hex. What that means was, in the past, if Ornn and Yorick and Thresh died, they wouldn't actually give the Behemoth buff to Shen, which is a big deal because Shen scales off of resistances, plus it's supposed to give him tankiness. And so now that it works better, you can actually have Shen just be more consistent in the backline. And of course, you can still put him towards the front if you need to. The build that we have settled on these days is 2 Rage Blades plus a Bramble Vest. Titans is actually the same as Bramble Vest for Shen in the data, but Bramble is easy to build because, you know, good luck getting 3 bows. Sometimes it's hard enough to get more than 1 Rage Blade. If you do get a Radiant Rage Blade, you don't need a second Rage Blade. Instead, you can go for healing or like a Giant Slayer or something else. The composition is pretty straightforward. Just roll for 6 Behemoth when you can and get in the Ghostly. So a lot of times on 6, you're either rolling for 6 Behemoth if you're able to fortunately hit an Ornn, or you go for 4 Behemoth plus Ghostly and then another unit to support. Shen's also really good with some of the artifacts. We talked about Talisman. Death Defiance is really good. And Shen has a couple of other ones which are really nice. Yorick 3 is actually not that important. You just really need Shen 3. And what makes this composition really strong is actually hard to kill Shen 2. So don't feel like you have to nuke your economy to roll for Shen 3 really early. Sometimes another 2-cost reroll, it feels like if you don't hit by the middle of stage 4, you're really far behind. But I've seen Shen players really take their time to get online, and it's totally fine. Things like Ascension or ways to help get, you know, delayed power throughout the second half of the fight is also really good for Shen. And if you're able to get like a Behemoth Crest, it gives you an extra slot on the team, which is always really nice. It's just a really strong and fun comp to play. The biggest counterplay to this is that if you are contested by other Ghostly players, just be very mindful that Shen 3 is going to be hard to hit. I was watching a tournament actually on my stream where someone hit 4 Shens in total while rolling a bunch of gold because other people were playing Ghostly reroll and other people were just holding Shens naturally, that it just felt like they were so far off. So just don't be that person. If you scout around and see a bunch of people taking like Ghostly +1s or ankling that, just keep in mind that you have to roll a little bit more aggressively in those scenarios because you're contested. The best forecast to play around this patch, in my opinion, is Dryad Fated Syndra. This composition has actually become way more flexible though, because as much as we have itemized around Syndra, you slam blue buff, you slam Nashers, and play around her, you actually can play also around Kindred a lot, or have Azir and Sylas be secondary carries that really bring a lot of DPS into the composition. And Sylas is also good as an item holder for things like Fated. You can also give him Dryad because he scales really nicely off of that AP. And so you actually have a lot of different options at your disposal. The thing about it is this Sylas spot also used to be Annie, so you do have more flexibility as well with who you roll for. And one thing worth noting is don't just roll always for the 5 Fated and 4 Dryad. Actually, I think in this guide, we say look for 5 Fated and 4 Dryad, but that's like the cookie cutter version of it. The reality is, as you get better at this composition, you realize you're not going to always hit Set, you're not going to hit Azir, and you're probably not going to hit Syndra and Sylas really often. So you have to make do with what you got. So a lot of times what ends up happening is you play Ahri, Kindred, and Thresh, and then Ornn, Gnar, and then you just kind of play like whatever else you hit. If you hit like a Nautilus 2 with the Warden, that gives you extra frontline stall. You might even get things like Alune to pair with Sylas and play a little bit around that as well. And so you have to have flexibility with how you're actually itemizing, because the reality is if you have pretty generic items like a Shojin because you don't want to slam blue buff and other things like that, you just have to be very open-minded. On that note, by the way, Combat Caster and Baboom did get nerfed, but they are still very good in this composition because they actually buffed it while bug fixing for Kindred, so that is worth noting. And this composition utilizes a lot of strong AP augments that you're always willing to get. Combat augments are really nice for this composition, but the thing about this comp is that it wins out really often by stabilizing and having just critical mass of HP. So sometimes you can even get away with taking like triple econ, hitting everything, and then, you know, having a bunch of items and a 2-star board is good enough to win out. 7 Storyweaver is still really good right now and is now climbed to be one of the best comps in the game if you can get a Storyweaver crest of some kind or the emblem. Usually you play this off of a Wandering Sentinel, or you just get an early Storyweaver crest to start things off. And you want to get to 3, 5, 7 Storyweaver very fast ahead of curve. Ideally, by the beginning of stage 3, you're playing 5 Storyweaver. And if everything goes well, by 4-2, you should be playing 7 Storyweaver and snowballing your lead. If you do end up getting the 7 Storyweaver, the unit that you end up cutting is Sivir, and Sivir is an item holder for Irelia. And there's also a debate about what is the best first talisman for Kayle. Red, blue, blue is pretty standard according to what is done a lot in pro play, mainly in China. But there's a lot of data suggests that blue is still good if you're playing like Zoe 3 with Zyra, because then you go blue, blue, blue KO with Zoe Zyra, and then Irelia's in the far corner, or maybe you buff Morgana. And then there's also debate about whether or not green, the talisman of shredding, where you just get a little bit of extra Asunder and MR shred, that also is really good because it helps you be up an item and you don't have to use things like Spark early. So there's a lot of debate on like what actually ends up being good, and I think the takeaway is kind of depends on what you feel like your spot really needs. If you have like a Spark to slam with the Storyweaver crest to start off at 2-1, then probably don't pick green. You can instead go for like red or blue. If you're playing around Sivir 2 because you have really good items for Sivir and you're going like red buff plus other things, maybe go for red Kayle. And if you're just starting off with like an early Zyra 2, maybe you pick blue. The best last 9 board still is Irelia and Azir, although now more people are playing Hui and people are establishing that Hui might be better. And then the other thing we've kind of established is that it's harder to play around Ornn in the current meta because a lot of people are picking up Ornn for things like the Dryad Faded line, as well as picking up Ornn in a lot of their other makeshift comps, whether they're playing anything that pairs with Dryad, or maybe they're playing like, the Shen hero augment, they just pick up Ornn. So as a result, you're playing a cheaper frontline now with like Galio and Riven, lean a little bit more into Bruisers. Galio got better, so he should be a better frontline, but it's still very open-ended and it is very flexible. And as we talked about, it's very dependent on your Exalted. So just make sure you're always trying to tag in Exalted, Irelia, +1 AP carry like Azir and Hui. Maybe even play into like the Lillia setup if you can. It's very, very good, and the 4 Dragon Lord just gives you good AoE stun. Irelia has Red Buff, Guard Breaker, and Infinity Edge. That is another newer build that is very powerful. I think we were talking to Dishope about it on the podcast for TFT Study Hall. You should check this out. Awesome podcast, by the way. It's a weekly podcast where I meet up with Dishope to review the current state of the meta and give you some comps that maybe are sleepers, as well as some fundamental skills like positioning, econ management, augment selection, so on and so forth. It's a good podcast, trust me. It's audio only, but it's very fun to make, and I think a lot of people really like it. Anyways, on this podcast, we were talking about how Red Buff and Guard Breaker might be just BIS Irelia in general, and then IE is really good because Infinity Edge now works on Irelia, 1, and also maxes out your critical strike chance, which is really powerful. But if you don't, you can also just go for like Runins, Deathblade, the usual stuff. Hard to hit this comp, but if you get there and you hit everything, it's just very, very good. Play it on high resource portals and encounters. There's a couple of hero augments here at the bottom of S tier, which are also performing really well still in the data, and I think there's no reason to move it down. Right now we have Kabuko with Lucky Paws and playing a vertical bruiser strategy while trying to top out with 5 costs at level 9. This is a pretty straightforward composition. You roll for Kabuko 3 very early on at stage 3-1 with as much gold as possible. You lose streak early, try to get Kabuko 3, and then use Lucky Paws to print you gold back, because if Kabuko kills an enemy, you get your economy online and rolling. That economy helps give you more HP for Kabuko's passive. That being said, this makes it much more important that you hit Kabuko early. This is in contrast to Garen's hero augment, which we'll talk about in a second, where you can kind of take your time on Garen. And also Kabuko is pretty item specific. You need Dragon's Claw and Redemption. And if you don't have a lot of AD in the lobby, maybe instead of Bramble Vest, you play for a Spark or something else that just makes sense for Kabuko, maybe more DR or something else. Silas takes leftover items, and then you could backline carry Irelia if you have a Bruiser emblem. That's really good with the AD, but you can also just play like, any kind of generic AP. So for example, you're playing Galio Riven, you can play Morgana and Zyra because you have the Ghostly that ties into the Aatrox, and then the Sage with the Storyweaver. So that's like one thing you can do. Just push levels and try to get, your top 2, top 3 secured, with the upside of maybe winning if you are high rolling a lot more than usual. The other hero augment reroll is Garen. Garen is much more flexible with items than Kabuko. In fact, if I were to be really nitpicky about this tier list, I'd probably put Garen slightly ahead of Kabuko right now, like one place over to the left. And I really like Garen's versatility with items. We found out that Dragon's Claw is much better than Bloodthirster as a healing item because Garen, 1, wants to take the aggression so he can cast again. He has a mana nerf from the previous patch where now he wants to just cast a little bit more faster by drawing aggression, and then Dragon's Claw helps him heal back based off that max HP. And then Sterak's Gauge is really good, and the third item can be Titans, but a lot of times you're replacing Titans with another like really powerful artifact. 3 best artifacts are Innervating Locket, Talisman of Ascension, and Silvermere Dawn. Get 6 Warden as soon as you can after you roll for Garen 3, and then push levels for 5 costs, similar to Kabuko. And you're going to be loot streaking early, collecting Garens. Slow roll for Garen. You don't necessarily need to actually hit Garen 3 as fast as you do need to hit Kabuko 3, so you can actually take your time. I've seen people hit Garen 3 as late as stage 4 and still have a completely fine game. And then outside of 6 Wardens, the backline is flexible. We have just an example of Irelia and Zoe, but you really could play almost anything as long as you just have consistent backline damage. That makes sense. I made a video on how to play Garen Reroll and why it was so good on the previous patches, and most of that still carries over, except maybe don't pick it if you have 0 Garen items and 0 Garens. At least have like one of those 2 things. Last but not least, in S tier, we got Mythic Invoker Lillia Flex. Lillia has so many variants that you can actually play, which are really powerful and situational depending on your augments and the portals in the setup. You can play the Mythic setup that we have here, which is a powerful vertical. You can play Invokers. You can also put Lillia into other compositions like the Sages, the Umbrals, throwing it into alongside Ashe, like the Porcelain Ashe Invoker setup. So there's so many different variants of Lillia that are really good. And I think that's a really cool thing. It's sort of a design triumph and comeback from the first part of the set where Lillia felt so bad and awkward. Now she's a really flexible and fun champion with so many different nuances and ins and outs. So you could just say, I want to learn Lillia for the rest of the set and be a really good Lillia player, and you probably won't master it by the time set 11's over. If you do end up playing Invokers, by the way, it's usually because you hit one off of like a target dummy, like you get the Wandering Sentinels and you get a +1 Invoker, or something crazy like Loot Subscription, you get a Tome. That's usually when you play like 6 Invoker, because the problem is, similar to snipers, you struggle with frontline. You just don't have like good enough frontline besides Annie and Nautilus. You kind of want more than that. And so you run out of spaces. You have to play like Janna here instead of, like one of these meaty frontline units. So don't really like aim to play 6 Invoker very often. But if you do, you don't actually really need mana items. I know a lot of people actually talk about blue buff for Shojin. If you're playing like a very deep vertical Invoker, you could probably just, put 3 damage items in Lillia, and that's fine, and try to like spread out, like make sure Zir gets items and Hui. A tier has so many situational compositions that actually can compete with S tier as long as you know exactly how to activate them and what makes them strong. So at the very top, we have a new comp of Yone, Reaper Bruisers, which I think is going to change. This is the composition I was most afraid and hesitant to show in the video because I'm pretty sure this variant of Yone is not the optimal one. So by the time you watch this video, if it's like a couple days after I posted, you should definitely check the website again in the tier list for TFT Academy because it might even be different. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I don't think 4 Bruisers is really what makes Yone strong. It's more that I think the tempo that you can get through having Silas and Galio and high quality units alongside the Reapers is what makes it good. You give time for these 4 Reapers to actually get to the backline and snipe things. Like all these Bruisers kind of make sense if you think about the synergies of it. Like 4 Bruiser, a good amount of HP. Silas activates Umbral for Yone, Aatrox activates Ghostly, and Rek'Sai activates Dryad. So like, why not? What's not to love? Also, this Kha'Zix here is just for fun because, this is a Reaper emblem. If you get it on Silas, it's really good. But at its core, the reality is Yone is back, and he's being mixed and matched with other 4 costs and trying to play Yone less around Heavenly and all these like cheap Heavenly units to support him, but instead playing high quality units independent of Yone. In the past, Yone was so broken that he would actually be the tank and the carry. The Heavenly was to give him so many defensive traits with a little bit of offense. Then he was stacking with Titans to give him the defensiveness and the scaling with his AP on the shield to eventually just kill everything. But now that they've reworked Heavenly, it's not about Yone being the hyper carry where he does everything. It's more like he relies on his teammates to actually tank for him, like Galio and these other Bruisers, and you stall out for Yone to assassinate. So now that we have that macro set in stone, what exactly makes this comp good? I'm pretty sure it's the Exalteds. There's an Exalted variation that has Kha'Zix, Galio, and Kayn. And then there's 2 Exalteds that have Yone and Galio, which basically allows you to get it for free as long as you get like a Reaper emblem, and you can just snowball and totally dominate your opponents. If you get that and you pair it with, the Grim Harvest, which got buffed, as well as, really strong combat augments like Tiny but Deadly, you will win the game in snowball. But yeah, Yone is back. Have fun wiping people's Ashes and Lilias and other stationary backline units. Hooray! Speaking of Reapers that are back in vogue, Heavenly Kayn is back, although he actually has 2 aspects of him, the 2 conditions that you want to activate him. One is the Heavenly emblem, and you just play like vertical Heavenly, like how we used to play the Heavenly Kayn in the past. But the version that we're featuring right now is the Heavenly Fine Vintage Kayn, where you play a bunch of support items, and you make Kayn now kind of the Lee Sin of the previous patches, just unkillable, snowballing, and very difficult to deal with. If you do end up getting Kayn, give him some resistances with Age of the Legion and Randuin's. Banshees is really important to make sure that he doesn't get CC'd. And if you can find things like Obsidian Cleaver or Flame or just like Morello for anti-heal, that's pretty much all you really need. Don't need to go crazier beyond that. You still can play Lee Sin and Kayn as a Heavenly duo, but you don't have to as much, because if you get the Find Vintage version, you can just like 1v9 everything as Find Vintage does. And the one augment I want to shout out in particular that makes Kayn very good is Little Buddies. This augment is very, very insane. If you do end up getting it, please don't skip it. Extremely good with Kayn, and gives him everything he wants. Sage Lillia is now kind of the weaker version of Lillia, but it's the one that does better in the data. Morgana is also more contested this patch. Just, more people are playing Kayn and trying to pair him with Morgana. So just be mindful that it's harder to hit these units. But the good news is this is like one of many other different versions of Lillia. And we just wanted to show like what was going on with other versions of Lillia that's moving down, because if we only showed you one variation of Lillia, that feels dishonest to how flexible she can be. But the core of it is like ultimately just playing very open with AP items. You're slamming Shojin and Deathcap or, JG on Zyra and Storyweavers. You're playing very open-ended. You can even play a Faded Opener and pivot into this as well. So it's a really good default comp. Default meaning if you don't know what you're playing and you have like a Shojin and AP items with a Spark, you can always just like think about this comp as like a comp to roll towards. And it functions really well, but you need a lot of upgrades and it's very expensive. Umbral Flex, one of my favorite comps. It's still just as good. And what's really interesting about Umbral is that it's becoming kind of a shell like Ghostly, where you just play a good set of Umbrals and then whatever package that makes sense as a secondary source of damage. So you always have your primary source of damage, which is Sylas and Alune as like the AP combo. AP is really important on Alune. Don't just go like Shojin, Nashor's, Morello on her. You're just going to have little damage. And Sylas really cares about having survivability, so make sure you give him like Crown Guard and Adaptive. But then you also have like another source of damage. And the past patches, it was like, Lillia could slot in here, for example, or people would play like Azir Ornn. Because Kayn is better now, you can kind of tech Kayn back in as another carry and now play him inside the Umbral shell because, him and Yone are good. And what do you know? Yone 3, if you get Yone 3, you can also play around Yone 3 plus Alune. Ghostly AP Reroll is the best version of Ghostly, in my opinion. I think it's better than Senna, which we'll talk about very briefly later on. The thing about this composition is that you kind of need Prismatic Ticket or something else. Like, even if you have a Ghostly +1, that doesn't usually mean that you should go ahead and roll for it. Like, if you get a Ghostly emblem to start things off, that's not like a hard commit to it. And that's because you just need so much to get online. You need Zoe and Zyra and Shen 3 with items. And you just need like so much to get online. But what makes it really good is that this composition at 2-star is hyper stable. Like, it's so good on stage 3 and stage 4. You might be win streaking against boards. You're like, I'm beating like 4-cost boards on stage 4. Should I just, stay on this board and reroll, or should I level to 9? And the answer is you could do either. You can actually, collect extra Zoes and Zyras and be like ready to pivot still. But if you keep getting hit with more Zoes and Zyras, just commit to the reroll. Bard reroll has gotten a lot better because they buffed the 3-cost odds, which are really crucial because this composition on Bard 2 and Tahm Kench 3 is terrible. And when you hit Bard 3 and Tahm Kench 3, as long as you get reasonable items on them, like the Rage Blades plus something else for Bard and good defensive item for Tahm Kench, pretty much unkillable. So I will say this composition very secretly actually might be S tier if you hit like the Wit's End and good stuff for Tahm Kench. We talked about it before, but Tahm Kench with Forbidden Idol is a good combo, but Eternal Winter is actually a better item than Forbidden Idol for Tahm Kench. I mean, heaven forbid that you get 2 of them. Like, there's been situations where I've seen Forbidden Idol and Eternal Winter. That is a complete game over situation. And then the other thing is that they buffed 2 trick shots, so Sivir and Bard is now a better combo. And they also buffed Soraka 3. So if you get Soraka 3, you give her items, give Zoe items. I mean, what's not to love? Bruiser Flex is still a thing, and I think now kind of finding some footing where if you just get a Bruiser +1, you can play high tempo and fit in a bunch of Exalteds, because you can play 4 to 6 Bruisers very easily in the mid game, get Exalted in. Push to 9, play around 5 costs, and just put a bunch of pants on these bad boys. Like, just get Galio and Sylas all decked out, dressed up, and then just put Irelia in the back line, just have a good time. I mean, it looks very similar, actually, to the Kabuko hero augment. If you look at the setup, it's pretty much the same. It's just like Bruisers all in one row and then just like some backline 5 costs. So it's a very simple comp and very effective. Well-fed is very good, but if you get like Martyr, it's insane. And Unified Resistance heavy hitters, like these are all just really, really good stuff. I think you do need the Bruiser +1 though of some kind, so I would not try to play this just if you open up with 2-star Bruisers. Kai'Sa. The condition for Kai'Sa is be rich. Just make sure you have a lot of resources. People like to play Fortune, and the composition is not like the most expensive, but it's the most punishing for not having everything online, because if you have, 1-star Kai'Sa, you might lack the burst. If you have too weak of a frontline, like 1-star Galio, you just get crushed. And so a lot of times you just need a little bit extra. This composition wants as many items and econ and combat augments as possible. So that's why a lot of people play for Fortune and then take some combat augments afterwards. They did buff 2 trick shots, so you're much more stable. That ironically sometimes messes up your mid to late game if you're trying to lose, but you're playing like a competitive board. That's ironically like something that ends up helping the situation where maybe you're trying to preserve HP and trying to kill units with 2 trick shots while you're transitioning. So definitely really useful. Xayah is really good and a really strong win condition to make a strong comeback. One thing to note is that I've seen people hit 1 Kai'Sa, 1 Xayah, and then choose to itemize Kai'Sa. And while that is understandable because you think you can hit Kai'Sa 2 much more likely, the reality is Xayah 1 is better than Kai'Sa 1. So if you're in a desperate situation with Fortune, you have very little lives, and you're holding, Xayah pair and Kai'Sa 1, itemize Xayah in that spot because she is way stronger of a DPS unit in those late game scenarios than Kai'Sa 1. And another strong conditional reroll composition is in A tier. It's Teemo Lux Reroll. It was C tier just a patch ago, and now I think people are really caught on that Blooding Jewel Teemo is legit. It is very good, and if you compare it with Lux, now they buffed 2 trick shot. Teemo can actually do some serious damage. In the ideal scenario, you actually are able to snowball this. You're not really supposed to play it too far from behind. You start off with like a Blooding Jewel early and a Teemo, and you start winning. And yes, blue buff is the best item, but sometimes it's like Shojin Nashers just because you need to. Blue buff is the best item for Teemo. And if you don't get Nashers, go for like Gunblade or something like that. Just something to heal your front line. Lux and Teemo end up tag teaming and shooting backline together and eliminating things. It's a very fun comp, but yeah, you need Blooding Jewel and ideally like a good Exalted. So Kog'Maw Reroll is the other 1-cost reroll to play around and still very consistent. Just kind of been old faithful all set long. 3-star Kog'Maw, 3-star Cho'Gath, itemize both. Pump levels for Mythic, get items on Lillia and Hui, and generally pick just good combat augments that make sense. Mythic +1, very good. Kog'Maw wants blue buff Nashers, that's his best items. Third item could be like whatever. A lot of times people are actually itemizing Kog'Maw, which is straight up AP, like a Jewel Gauntlet. And don't miss. Just make sure you hit early. If you are late on Kog'Maw 3 and Cho'Gath 3, and it's like end of stage 3, you will struggle and probably buff 4. But if you hit early, good stuff. And then Ashe is the bottom of A tier, and she's semi-conditional. If you get like a Sniper +1 or a Warden +1, that's usually the go-ahead to play Ashe. If you get attack speed or other combat that's really good for Ashe, you can also play her. But she's just weaker now, and you really want to capitalize on the fact that things like 6 Sniper is really good, or Ashe isn't contested, or you just have perfect items for it, combat augments like pumping up. That's when you play Ashe. Before, people defaulted in this comp a lot, but now I don't think it's the case. So just make sure that you have the proper setup. All right, let's blast through B and C tier because there's just too much to go through. So I'll do my best to cover it. But in reality, B tier just means that it's going to be more situational. And even if you do hit, you might struggle against some of the top comps unless the stars align. There's 2 exceptions, and that's the 2 comps that we have here, which is Zoe Arcanist and Gnar. I do think that these 2 comps can win lobbies. And the condition for Zoe is that the Arcanist augments are really good because they just get you rolling early. Like Arcanist Crown just gives you Zoe and a Shiv, so that just gives you tempo. And if you can get 3-star Alawi, 3-star Mumu with Arcanist, you can actually do very well. 8 Arcanist is no joke, and the problem with 8 Arcanist is frontline. So if you get Alawi 3, a Mumu 3, you can actually just straight up destroy everything. One augment that's not listed here that might actually be really good for Arcanist is 2 for 1. So just keep that in mind. Gnar is the other composition that I think has potential as a B tier that can actually move up to A tier and win lobbies because the artifact combinations are really powerful. Specifically, Corrupted Vampiric Scepter and Silver Mirror Dawn on Gnar are very good. And we have the 2 builds listed out of what you would want. If you do play Corrupted Vampiric Scepter, make sure you go for a bunch of attack speed like Rageblade and Quicksilver to stop that. Although if you don't build Quicksilver, you could probably go for Titans. And then Gnar with Silvermere Dawn wants as much Omnivamp as possible, so go for a Bloodthirster and Hodge. Duelists. So how the mighty have fallen. Duelists now went from an S tier comp to kind of a B tier comp and really requires you to have Duelist. In fact, by the time we update this, we probably should put a Duelist emblem because that's the only time I really want to play Duelist. I've seen people start with Keepers and like Extended Duel and still like barely get forwards even though they have the good opener. It's because they nerf 4 and 6 Duelists, which is a lot. of mid-game power that helps snowball that composition to the late game. So I would probably stay away from Duelist. I could actually see this composition moving further down as the meta gets optimized, because Duelist is also an easy cookie cutter comp. And so if it's not doing well at the beginning of the patch, heaven forbid what happens when we optimize things in the metagame and now it goes up against strong compositions. So I'm generally not a big fan of Duelist. I'm not trying to play as many games as possible. Safe Silas is just kind of like what happens when you don't hit Lillia right now, or you end up hitting like an early Sylas, and you just have a lot of things that like end up being good for Sylas for some reason. So a variation that you can play, but I would not recommend leaning towards this a lot unless you know what you're doing. It's also very tempo oriented. So a lot of times you end up playing like Sylas 2 with some of this, not all of this, because you're not hitting the 5 cost. You're hitting a bunch of 2 and 3 cost. You push to 9, and then you end on this comp for like a solid second or third. Porcelain Ashe got better because they buffed Annie, and now Annie with Porcelain Emblem might be back. This might be single-handedly the reason to play this comp if you get a Porcelain Emblem. So even though Ashe got nerfed, this is yet another Lillia variation that you can play. And just something to keep in mind, we did play this version a couple patches ago, so it is in the back pocket of your mind if you are opening Porcelain Emblem. Or another thing, the possibility is if you get a Lillia opener and you're trying to play Lillia, and all of a sudden you get a bunch of 80 items and you get a Porcelain Emblem, that's possibly a way you can kind of bridge it all together instead of hard committing to like Sage Lillia and then feeling like you can't do anything with these swords. Yorick and Nico hero augments are just getting gapped by the other hero augments. They're not actually bad, but they are increasingly weaker at higher level because they just don't generate enough, and they have some awkwardness around how consistent you can hit. So with Yorick, for example, you actually want to push levels with Yorick, but the more you push levels, the worse odds you are to hit the 2 cost. And then that makes it kind of awkward because if you stay too long at level 6 and 7 rolling for Yorick, you're not going to get access to what makes it truly strong, which is Set and Sylas in the 5 costs. But if you go all the way to 9, you're probably going to have Yorick too, and then you just don't have like a strong hero augment, which makes you feel like you're kind of down an augment. So that's kind of the awkwardness you have to overcome with the Yorick hero augment, but otherwise it's good. And then with the Nico hero augments, the problem is that Nico's really contested. She's picked up in a bunch of Sage variants. She's picked up in Lillia Mythic variants. Heavenly is now more popular again because of Kayn. And if someone just plays like Arcanist, they're going to take Nico. And Nico's just a good splash if you have Heavenly. So Nico is like the hardest hero augment to get online. So what ends up happening a lot is you end up trying to collect like 6 or 7 Nicos and then push to level 8, find Hui, and then have Hui print the final 2 or even 3 Nicos over the course of the stage. And that's how you get Nico 3. I think Nico 3 with this hero augment is very, very good. But Nico 2 falls off really hard and just kind of like, you know, peters out and you don't really do much. Build Different was too good for a patch because they buffed all the 4 costs and then they nerfed all the 4 costs. And then they didn't buff Build Different to compensate, so it was terrible. And now back-to-back patches, they buffed Build Different. So now it's at a respectable level, but it's not like super dominant. And I think you have to play well and have a lot of items and resources, so it's kind of conditional. Ghostly Center Reroll is just not very real to me because it's just so hard to hit. Every one of these units are contested. Shen hero augment peoples want Shen, and Ghostly AP Rerolls want Shen. And literally everybody wants Alawi. You're just not going to hit Alawi 3. Kayn is more contested. Morgana is very contested. The Bruiser players want Aatrox. I mean, like, how are you supposed to hit this comp ever? It's just so hard. And even if you do hit, it just feels like it's weaker at its top end power level than the AP reroll. So it's okay. I would say that this is the spot to go for if you have a really strong Senna opener, or maybe you get like a dummy that like leans into, you know, this composition with like the Ghostly +1. You get like a Ghostly Ink Shadow Warden setup or something. Saving Ink Shadow got buffed this patch. I mean, so did Senna. So I'm kind of talking trash about comps that just got buffed. But Saving Ink Shadow in general is playing too many dead units. You have to play like Volibear, which doesn't do anything. Jax, which doesn't do anything. Udyr, which can do something, but you know, you kind of have to have 2-star plus items on him for him to do anything. And then you have like Senna, which is like whatever. And you're just like, okay, so I'm playing Kai'Sa, Xayah, and like Alawi. That's my comp. Very good. Those great units, but I think that's where it struggles. Last but not least in B tier, we got Janna Reroll, which got buffed with her direct damage. And this actually covers into a couple different variations. In Asia Pacific, they call this comp fairies because you're rolling for Janna 3, Zoe 3, Diana 3, ideally Zyra 3, and maybe Soraka 3. Like, you just go for 3-star like everything. And you can also mix and match. If you're not going for Janna 3, you can go for like Zoe Zyra. If you're not going for Zyra, let's say you're playing, you know, like 3-cost stuff, you can play Zoe Soraka. If you're not going for that, you can go, you know, you're not doing that, you can do Jan or Zyra. There's like a lot of different ways you can kind of mix and match, but Jan is the most consistent core of that like people like to play around. Moving on to the bottom tier. These are the experimental slash meme slash once in a blue moon compositions that you'll play. Like maybe you'll play it once a set. I still have yet to play any of these compositions even one time in recent memory. The first is Revive Storyweaver with green Tome of Mending, which revives the strongest ally that hasn't been revived yet. Strongest in this case means the unit with the most items. So Lissandra with a Suspicious Trenchcoat and the Vows ends up dying and reviving, and then the Suspicious Trenchcoat splits and you just get a bunch of Lissandras to spam cast. Very fun, very powerful even at top level, but very situational because you need to hit the 7 Storyweaver, you need to hit the Suspicious Trenchcoat, you need to get like the perfect items, and you need to be able to survive long enough to get it to be a good spot. Second comp, Kabuko no Hero Sivir. This is a composition I made a YouTube video about because I thought it was so funny. I think that the name of the composition was just so funny to me because it's a no hero augment Kabuko reroll composition featuring Sivir Teemo. And a couple players climbed the challenger with it. Very off meta. It's like Bruiser Trickshot Reroll. And in reality, it's so little sample size that it's kind of hard to even say like what is this. But if you want to check it out, I'm pretty sure it's red buff over Rageblade, but Rageblade is more consistent and easier to get early on because your early game does matter. And it's very, very fun if you can get it online. Kind of similar to like the Teemo Lux, but you're playing Teemo Sivir with your trick shots. Instead of playing Wardens because the Moo tags with Lux, you have Sivir, which attaches to Galio and Riven. All right, we hinted at it before, but Riven Reroll is also a thing which you play around the Sage Bruiser core synergy, and you can tech in with like the Soraka Zyra core as well. If you want to play Heavenly Fine Vintage, you can. Pretty much no one plays it anymore. In fact, we're pretty close to taking this off. But it is a thing still, technically. It's just super duper whooper high roll. Like, just how do you get like these many items and survive and get all these 5 costs? It's just not really a thing anymore right now. So if you haven't get a chance to pull it off yet, try at least once. I promise you it's really fun. Lissandra prints the items. Irelia kills everything. But very unlikely for you to hit right now. Ghostly Flex is mostly about when you hit 8 Ghostly, you really want the 2 emblems. And if you can get to 8 Ghostly plus good upgrades, it's very good. Kai'Sa got buffed with trick shots this patch, so it should theoretically be better for the Ghostly variations. But you can also still play Ashe and Syndra, depending on what your setup is. But it's mostly like 8 Ghostly plus upgrades and get to, you know, your upgraded 5 costs. Good stuff. If you have no upgrades and you hit 8 Ghostly, you're probably just going to die and not really kill anything and then be wondering why 8 Ghostly sucks so much. Last but not least is Kha'Zix Reroll. You know, they buffed Grim Harvest. They buffed 4 Reapers. Kha'Zix probably is better as well. I mean, we have this experimental tag because like we really don't know the capabilities of it. I saw someone reroll Kha'Zix in tournament and he went 7th, like a hard 7th. And he had Kha'Zix 3 at 3-1 with a pretty good setup, like not today and Epoch and everything like that. I think what went wrong is that he didn't have Omnivamp on Kha'Zix. He had like Last Whisper, Edge of Night, and a damage item, and Kha'Zix really needs that healing. So there you have it, all the nuts and bolts of the metagame, and I think this patch is actually in a pretty good spot. I look at it holistically, and all kinds of playstyles are viable. There's a lot of reroll comps that are now back at every tier, and you can also go fast 8, fast 9. You can play greedy. You can play like win out strategies. There's even like conditional, like open up these items, do this, hit this augment, do that. So there's a lot of fun things you can do in the game. And if you're exhausted and you're saying like, hey, this is still just not my thing, well, guess what? The good news is set 12 is just around the corner, which I will be shifting my focus on that pretty soon. I'll make one more tier list patch update for the Worlds patch in about 2 weeks, but that'll be my last video, I think, on set 11. And then just like that, we're going to be getting ready for set 12. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Climb to the rank you've always deserved, and I'll see you guys next time.